The Crito is really an extremely subtle meditation on the nature of political order. Oddly enough, it's a very short dialogue, and it's ostensibly about Socrates' refusal to escape from prison and go into exile. But actually underlying it, I think, is a schema about the nature of different forms of human association. And I think that you can understand what's going on by getting the schema fixed in mind. And there are three levels of human association, what you can call pre-political, political, and trans-political association. Now, pre-political association is basically association of friends, neighbors, family members. Pre-political association is always personal interaction with people who you know. What binds people into pre-political forms of association are really, you can call, the sentiment of loving one's own, if you will, and certain desires. Sexual desire brings people together, for instance, into pre-political forms of association, and various forms of affections and attachments to things that are familiar or close to you bind these forms of association together. Now, the most primitively pre-political form of association is really the association of individuals who are simply out for the satisfaction of their desires, because desire really does isolate people, except for sexual desire, which makes it an interesting thing because it brings people together. But most desires tend to be isolating. They tend to be each individual, and they bring individuals together in purely self-seeking forms of association. We'll put it this way. In the realm of pre-political association, what you find are groups that are bound together by ties of affection. And the association between groups or between people from different groups, the association you find with strangers, tends to be reduced down to pure considerations of self-interest. Pure calculations of self-interest. The ethics of pre-political association is really a good man is one who helps his friends and harms his enemies. And this ethic, of course, is talked about, this view of justice is talked about in the first book of the Republic. And this is the kind of association that the Greek city-state was founded upon and existed in uneasy tension with throughout its entire existence, because the city-state was a larger political form of association that supervened upon these pre-political forms of association, namely families, but also tribes and clans. And you can see the presence of these pre-political forms of justice in the Euthyphro, in the distinction between laws that were civil and laws that were criminal. It was treated as a civil case if someone was murdered, meaning it was for the family, for one's own clan, one's pre-political associates to handle. It wasn't a matter that the state took any interest in. Or put it this way, the state took an interest in it only in the sense that it gave a legal form to private vendettas, which is what civil law basically does today. And so to that extent it managed it. But if you were murdered and no one was there left, to bring a case on your behalf, the state wouldn't do it. That wasn't their job. If you want to give examples of pre-political individuals that we've encountered so far in these dialogues, the first one would be Strepsiades, right? Strepsiades is entirely concerned with his family and with his self. And he has a very tenuous sense of what it is to be a good citizen. So he's willing to cheat his fellow citizens. He's willing to twist and break the laws, except, of course, when the laws are in his own interest. And then he appeals to them loudly. There's not a sense in Strepsiades of having a kind of unconditional attachment to the laws, a kind of civic spirit. That's entirely not there. His only relationship to the law is self-interested. So he's for the law when it's in his interest, and he's against it when it's not. And that's a purely pre-political form of attitude towards the laws. He's not so much a citizen as just a legal consumer or shirker, depending on his interest. Now, political association is different. Political association, first of all, requires a certain scale. You're never going to have a polis or a political society in a group of people who all know one another face to face. You can interact face to face. Why? Well, because you don't need it. You can pretty much keep everything on the level of personal ethics and so forth, and interpersonal ethics, the ties of personal attachment. So hunter-gatherer bands, for instance, are pre-political forms of association. They are extended families, or 2 or 3 extended families that exist together and have a sort of bond. But once you start getting to a certain size of community, then you find that you have to pass from pre-political to political association. And that is always entailed by this factor, that you don't know everybody in your city anymore. So your relationships with your fellow citizens are no longer personal relationships. And interpersonal relationships, or impersonal interactions between people in a political order, have to be, therefore, mediated by something more than just sentiments of attachment. They have to be mediated by impersonal laws. You need impersonal rules in order to allow strangers to interact with one another in a frictionless and just fashion in a political society. Now, once you start having laws, it's in principle conceivable that there's no limit to the size of political society. You could have a political society with hundreds of trillions of individuals as long as all the laws function. Because through these laws, you can relate to billions of other human beings with whom you could never form a personal relationship. You might not even ever see them, right? And so we have not only the political order that you find within nation states, but political order that exists across nation states too, through treaties and things like that. That's an extraordinary achievement, and it's becoming more and more global and homogeneous every day, political interaction that takes place. And the reason why I talk about how you can have global political society is I want to distinguish that from transpolitical association, which is different. If you were to have a global polis or a global state, that would still be a form of political association. It wouldn't be what I call transpolitical association up here. And what is transpolitical association? Well, transpolitical association is basically this. It leaves aside laws that are made by human beings, conventions that are created in order to coordinate the interactions of strangers in political society. And instead, it's regulated by an appeal to the laws of nature. In the light of a certain notion of an unchanging and common nature, an unchanging common natural right or justice, humanity appears to be one. In a radical sense, it's different than people would be one if they were all citizens of the same global state. Because the laws are natural rather than conventional. Politics is always conventional. And although you can conceive of a global polis, for the most part, political societies are a plurality. And this is why the conception of a global society is a kind of odd thing. You can only get to it by, in a sense, zapping out all the distinctions, the fundamental distinctions that exist between the political societies of the world today. And when you really think about what that would require, it would be a world that we wouldn't really be able to recognize as our own. But political association generally involves a plurality of different polises or political orders, and they're distinguished by having different sets of conventional rules or norms for integrating people's behavior or harmonizing people's actions. Let's go back to the transpolitical now. Transpolitical association requires the development of rationality to a high degree, because it's only by developing your rationality that nature becomes something that you know. You don't have to have highly developed rational faculties or any rational faculties at all to be a good citizen. You just have to have those sentiments that attach you to your own group, to your fatherland, or to your fellow citizens. And you can have people with those forms of attachments that don't have much going on upstairs at all in terms of rationality. But when it comes to getting to this transpolitical form of association, one of the conditions of it is the cultivation of rationality to a high degree. Now, and once you get to the cultivation of reason, you're going to arrive at a notion of a life of the mind that transcends conventional distinctions. You're going to find it possible for human beings on the transpolitical level to relate to one another in ways they could never relate to if they were just fellow citizens. My favorite example is Alexander Kojève, the Stalinist, and Leo Strauss, the ultra-conservative, were fast philosophical friends. Why? Their form of association was transpolitical, based on the life of the mind. And with the life of the mind, a lot of the distinctions of the Cold War era melted away. Neither one of them fundamentally saw that big a difference between Western capitalism and communism. They were viewing it from a very, very distant perspective. But of course, they would always be able to slip back into their political selves and take up opposite sides in the Cold War. But that wasn't the main form of association. And they would just agree to disagree on things like that. Now, Socrates, if Socrates belongs down here, Socrates clearly belongs up on the transpolitical level, orienting himself by what's right by nature. And Euthyphro, somewhere above the political, is not far enough above it to orient himself by what's right by nature. And so, if you want to look at the Euthyphro wants to get beyond the political level of life. And when Socrates encounters him, Socrates tries to get Euthyphro to turn around and resubmit himself to more conventional forms of association. He wants him to be a better citizen and a better son, and more pious in the conventional terms of Athenian society. Now, what we see in the Crito, and you have to understand the Crito in this terms of this distinction, Crito is very much like Socrates as a character. He's a totally pre-political individual. And what's going on in the Crito is that Socrates is educating him. He's trying to move him up from this pre-political form of association to political association. And that means he has to teach him a respect for conventional law. Even though Socrates himself looks to natural law for his guidance, he's trying to teach Crito to be concerned with conventional law and guide himself by that, rather than by this sort of dual ethic that you get in pre-political life, which is helping your friends and harming your enemies. And so this is what's happening in this dialogue. Crito was an old friend of Socrates, and appropriately enough, their form of friendship is entirely pre-political. They grew up near one another. They were members of the same deme, which was a pre-political division that existed in Athens. Or we'll put it this way, it was a political division that took into account pre-political tribal distinctions that existed long before Athens existed as a city-state. It's like the different states today used to be considered sovereign entities at one time, and now, of course, have no real sovereignty whatsoever. But the same borders still exist for many of them, and they have their capitals and so on and so forth. And in that sense, there's still a recognition of a status that they once had that they no longer have. And the demes are sort of the same thing for the ancient Athenians. Now, Crito is a very conventional-minded guy. And his friendship with Socrates is not based on the life of the mind, but simply on propinquity. They were born near one another, they grew up together, they've known one another all their lives, and they have a certain fondness for one another. That's a pre-political kind of fondness. Crito was no philosopher. Crito did write some Socratic dialogues out, and I really wish they had survived, because they probably would have been fairly unimaginative reports actual discussions that they went into, because Crito wasn't the kind of guy who would depart too much, I think, from what had actually happened. And if he did, it would probably be in a way that you could easily detect. But these texts haven't survived. So the setting is this: Socrates has been condemned, and he's being held in prison. However, he's been held in prison for some time because there was a custom that a barge would be sent from Athens to Delos every year, basically to pay respects to the god Apollo, who's one of his cult centers is on the island of Delos. And the rule was that there could be no executions in the city while the barge was away. But the barge had not returned and had been delayed for some time because of adverse winds. And so Socrates had a stay of execution. But the ship is returning, and Socrates soon will die. And so Crito comes to him before daybreak. Socrates wakes up, and Crito tells him that he has made preparations for Socrates to escape, and he can go into exile. And Socrates says, well, I'm not going to do this, and they have the argument that transpires here, and Crito is convinced not to oppose Socrates, and so Socrates simply stays for his execution. So let's look at the actual text. First of all, we have to recognize something about this text. It's before dawn. Okay, it's dark. The setting is darkness. And there's no indication in the text that the sun ever breaks over the horizon during the whole course of the conversation. In fact, there's no indication that Socrates ever really gets out of bed during the whole conversation. Now, he begins by relating a dream that he's had. And near the end of the text, he relates a speech that the laws of Athens would give to him. And the way that the speech is set up, page 108, at the bottom where Socrates speaks, Socrates, consider it as follows: what if the laws and the community of the city should come and stand before us who are about to run away? Now the note says, dreams were frequently said to stand before the person dreaming. And so his discussion of the laws brings out a sort of dreamlike quality. It's an imaginary dialogue with the laws, but it's framed as a kind of dreamlike apparition of the laws. So again, there's a somnolent quality about the whole thing, from the beginning where he reports his dream to the end where he has this dreamlike encounter with the laws. After he's done with the discussion on page 114, the center paragraph there, he says, know well, my dear comrade Crito, that these things are what I seem to hear, just as the corybants seem to hear the flutes. And this echo of these speeches is booming within me and makes me unable to hear the other speeches. At the bottom of a note, in connection with the worship of the goddess Cybele, a rite was developed to cure nervousness and hysteria by means of dancing to frenzied music played on the flute and kettle drum. Participants in this psychiatric exercise were called corybants. The present passage suggests that the music echoes, probably with a calming effect in the memory of those who have undergone the cure. But there's something of a possessive quality about this. There's an enchantment, a possession, a beguilement that the laws have over Socrates. That's the sense of saying that it's like the echoes of the corybantic frenzy to the voices of the laws. So everything in this dialogue is caught up and woven with the symbolism of sleep, dreams, and darkness. And this is extremely important because we have to recognize that this is a conversation down in the cave, if you want to use a republic's metaphor, right? And the cave refers to the world of opinion, of society. And in this case, the cave is a pre-political opinion. It's the worldview of Crito. Crito is a deeply, if you will, unenlightened fellow, and this shows in his preferences. Socrates wakes up and says to Crito, how long have you been sitting here? And he says, oh, quite some time. Well, why didn't you wake me? He says, oh, well, you seem to be sleeping so pleasantly. Socrates' preference is to be awake, but Crito can't think of anything more pleasant than being asleep. And this is an indication of their characters. Crito is a person who like sleeping and dreaming. He's a somnolent individual. And that's a wonderful symbol of a relatively unenlightened state of consciousness. Whereas Socrates wishes to be awake all the time, and that's an indication that his philosophic nature always seeks and prefers enlightenment.
I was reading that, and I figured there was something subtle in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying that now it seems obvious.
But then he's like somewhere where I don't see how you could sleep under these circumstances. So.
Yeah, he's saying, Socrates, I don't see how you can sleep like this. It's unusual. Montaigne has an essay on sleep where he talks about the amazing capacity reported amongst various, by ancient historians of certain men, wise men, to sleep. For instance, he talks about, and this is really not a perfect example of a wise man, but the Emperor Otho, who was one of the ephemeral emperors that followed Nero in AD 79, the year of the four emperors. He was going to commit suicide, and before he committed suicide, he took a nap. And he fell into a very deep sleep, waiting for some messenger to arrive, and they had to really shake him to wake him up. But the capacity to fall into such a deep sleep at such a critical state in life is sort of remarkable. And he talks about how Cato, before he disemboweled himself, got a good night's sleep. And it's a remarkable characteristic that you find with certain individuals. Napoleon was remarkable in this way. Napoleon could just turn his body off, just like that, and fall asleep. Even in the most high-tension situations where you and I would be climbing the walls, he could just fall asleep and remain completely unperturbed by it. I think it has everything to do with temperament, right? And there's certain temperaments that are just more capable of that than others. I'm totally incapable of that. I lose sleep over just the slightest worries. So let's go to the top of 100. Socrates, when Crito says, "How can you sleep so well?" says, "That's because it would be discordant, Crito, for someone of my age to be vexed if he now must meet his end." And what's the opposite of discord? Harmony, right? There's a sense in which the capacity to sleep like this is a result of the deep, composed harmony of soul that Socrates has. And this, of course, is very clear with Cato, too. And with any person whose mind is made up, they don't dither, right? I guess that's my problem. Once I could make up my mind that there was going to be no mail on Monday, then I could fall asleep. Here I am trying to teach people philosophy, and I'm kept awake at night by little things like that. This is why I need Stoicism. I keep going back to the Stoics. Eventually I'll be able to disembowel myself, but in the short term I hope I'll at least be able to fall asleep without knowing whether or not there'll be mail in the morning. So Socrates relates his little dream, and then Crito says, well, let's talk about avoiding this fate that you've got in store for you. Let's talk to you about getting you out of here. Crito has bribed the guard. Okay, again, first act, we hear about is really he's corrupting the laws. Why is he corrupting the laws? Why is he breaking the law? Well, he's doing it for a friend. And so Crito's preferences are always to take care of his friends, and the laws really don't make that much difference for him. Okay? When Crito appeals to Socrates to think about his duty to his sons, to his family, he never says anything about Socrates' duty to his fatherland, right, to the laws. Those sorts of duties don't exist in Crito's mind, or they're very tenuous. Again, the only time that Crito would probably appeal to the law is if it would be on his side. In that way, he's just like Strepsiades. Near the top of 101, Crito says, "But daimonic Socrates, even now obey me and save yourself, since if you die, for me it is not just one calamity. Apart from being deprived of such a companion as I will never discover again, you will also seem to many, those who don't know you and me plainly, to have been able to save you if I had been willing to spend money, but not to have cared. And yet what reputation would be more shameful than to seem to regard money as more important than friends? For the many will not be persuaded that you yourself were not willing to go away from here, although we were eager for it." And so the key for his motivations here is very clear. He's very concerned about the opinions of strangers And not so much their opinions of what really went on, but their opinions of what will seem to have gone on. He thinks it would be awful if strangers thought that he didn't care enough for his friend to spend his money to help his friend escape. This is an interesting motivation. He's very much concerned with the opinions of strangers, for one thing. Again, the priority of helping his friends is central in his mind. Helping his friends, harming his enemies. That's Crito's ethic. And Socrates says, but why do we care in this way, blessed Crito, about the opinions of the many? For the most decent men, whom it is more worthy to give thought to, will hold that these things have been done in just the way they were done. So Socrates immediately makes a distinction between types of opinion. There's the opinion of the many, and there's an opinion of decent men. And the only opinions that anybody should be concerned with are the opinions of decent human beings, the people who will know that things have been done properly. And Crito has nothing to fear from them because they'll know that things were done properly. Crito responds, but surely you see that it is necessary, Socrates, to care also about the opinion of the many. And of course the question is, what is the sense of necessity for caring about the opinions of the many? He says, well, the present situation makes it clear that the many can produce not the smallest of evils, but almost the greatest if someone is slandered among them. The necessity of paying attention to the many is that they can kill you, in other words. And Socrates' response at the top of 102 is extremely rich and interesting. Socrates says, would that the many could produce the greatest evils, Crito, so that they could also produce the greatest goods. Now this notion depends on this Greek premise that if you have an art, it gives you power over opposites, right? So the art of the doctor gives one the capacity to cure or to kill. The same with the art of the pharmacist, right? The pharmacist can be the most wily of poisoners, or the person who can give you the curative dose. And so he's saying that there's an art, in a sense here, that the many don't have. It's an art of producing the greatest of goods and also the greatest of evils. And what is the greatest of goods and the greatest of evils? Well, he goes on. He says, well, that would be noble, would indeed be noble to have that art. But as it is, they can do neither, for they aren't capable of making someone either prudent or imprudent. Now, the Greek word for prudence is phronesis. And another translation for that would be wisdom, in the practical sense of wisdom. There are two Greek words for wisdom, Sophia and phronesis. And Sophia generally is used to refer to either wisdom in a generic sense or theoretical wisdom. The kind of wisdom that Socrates in the clouds shows abundant possession of. However, phronesis refers specifically to practical wisdom, and that's the kind of wisdom Socrates doesn't have any shred of in the clouds. In fact, Strepsiades has more of it than Socrates in the clouds. Now, the greatest good, apparently, is to be prudent. And the greatest evil is to be imprudent. The greatest good is to be wise, and the greatest evil is to be foolish. Okay. Now, does this mean that Socrates has no concern anymore for Sophia, for wisdom in the theoretical sense? Well, not necessarily, because we could interpret the absence of the reference to Sophia as something explained by the fact that he's addressing Crito. And Crito is a deeply practical man. And so the only face wisdom would show to Crito would be practical wisdom. So it is possible that Socrates still has a concern with theoretical understandings of things, and it seems clear that he did. He continued to theorize throughout his life, but he also came to recognize at a certain point that not only is practical wisdom important, but in a sense practical wisdom is more important than theoretical wisdom, because theoretical wisdom without practical wisdom really isn't wisdom at all. It's just the kind of extravagant foolishness that you see Socrates of the clouds involved in. The greatest good is to be wise, and the greatest evil is to be foolish, and the many can't produce either one of them. Put it this way, theoretical wisdom without any ability to make right use of it really isn't wisdom at all. It's just kind of a comprehensive knowledge. And knowledge, by its nature, doesn't have to be good or evil. It needs to be given that direction by kind of practical wisdom. So, but the best thing is to have both. no question about it. What Crito then says is, well, look, Socrates, if you're worried that we'll get arrested, that the informers will turn us in, that will produce a great source of trouble for us, don't worry about us. We can handle that. We're wise in the ways of the world. We can take care of these things. And Socrates says, well, I was worried about that, Crito, but I was worried about many other things as well. And really more important things, too. And again, but it's very interesting. Crito sees Socrates' primary concerns as being practical concerns in this matter. And he says, well, let me assuage you that if your objections are this, then that's taken care of. Which is, again, an indication of the kind of man Crito is. He's very much caught up with the practical. And Socrates isn't disdainful of that by any means. But at the same time, he thinks that there are other more important concerns, and those concerns come out fairly quickly. And there's moral concerns about, again, the proper care of the soul. Although Socrates is put on trial again, so to speak, beginning at the top of 103, when Crito accuses him of doing a number of bad things and says that you'd better, defend yourself, and if you can't defend yourself, then you have to leave prison with me. And the accusations are basically this. He charges Socrates with betraying himself by allowing his enemies to get the better of him. He charges him of betraying his sons, not sticking around to educate and nurture them. Now, this really isn't that much of an issue, because if Socrates left, he probably couldn't have taken the children with him anyway to educate and nurture them. And even if the trial had never happened, given that he was a 70-year-old man in the time before modern medicine, chances are he wouldn't be around that much longer anyway to oversee their upbringing. The next paragraph after that is interesting, the center of 103. Instead, one should choose what a good and manly man would do. And manly, the andria, means also courage for the Greeks. Manliness and courage were the same word. So a good and courageous man would do, particularly if one has claimed to care for virtue throughout his whole life. For my part, I am ashamed for you and for us, your companions, that the whole affair concerning you will seem to have been conducted with a certain lack of manliness on our part. The way the lawsuit was introduced into the law court, even though it was possible for it not to be introduced, and this is very interesting, Socrates could have avoided the trial to begin with. The way that the judicial contest itself took place, and now this, the ridiculous conclusion of the affair, something comical even here, will seem to have escaped us completely because of a certain badness and lack of manliness on our part, since we didn't save you, nor did you save yourself, although it was possible and feasible if we had been even of a slight benefit, So he's saying that Socrates, you're betraying yourself, you're betraying your sons, you're making your friends look bad, and you're making yourself look bad. You're not acting in a manly and courageous fashion, because no man would let his enemies get the better of him. Okay, that's the response. At the top of 104, Socrates says, well, dear Crito, your eagerness is worth much if some correctness be with it. If not, the greater it is, the harder it is to deal with. So we should consider whether these things are to be done or not, since I, not only now but always, am such as to obey nothing else of what is mine than the arguments which appear best to me upon reasoning. And so he's being led by his arguments. He's going to be led by his reasoning, not by Crito's concern with the opinions of strangers and things like that, but by the best argument. Very interesting, at the very end of the dialogue, what he says, 114, Socrates' last words, and let it go, Crito, and let us act this way, since in this way the God is leading. The God is leading and reason is leading. Then in a sense you can say that for Socrates what's divine is reason, or the right thing to do by reason, or what's right by nature in a sense. The moral truth discoverable by reason is what's divine, which it fits in perfectly with what we know about the Euthyphro. 104, above the center of the page. He takes care, first of all, of the concern that Crito has with opinion. And he says, now, is it not the case, Crito, that you and I have always said that one should pay mind to some opinions and not others? Exactly. Now, and this is very important because the way that Socrates conducts this argument is interesting. Socrates is constantly saying, Crito, do you and I agree or not that this is the case? Crito, do you and I agree or not that this is the case? What he's doing is he's trying to build upon past agreements. Now, what are agreements between human beings? Well, they're conventions. And what's going on here is that Socrates is, in a sense, trying to lead Crito by getting him to submit himself to conventions that have been established between him and Socrates. Now, that is a sort of foreshadowing of what goes on later in the text when Socrates tries to lead Crito to a reverence for law, which consists of conventions that have been established by an entire society and consecrated by tradition and use. He's trying to lead Crito towards a submission to law, the conventional laws of political association. And the way he argues foreshadows that. So they go on and they talk about what kind of opinions are to be listened to. At the bottom of 104, Socrates says, to honor the upright opinions but not the villainous, yes. And aren't the upright ones those of the wise, the prudent, and the villainous ones those of the imprudent or foolish? Yes. So the only opinions you're supposed to have any mind to are the opinions of the wise. These are the only opinions that really matter. And then he goes on and he uses an analogy from craft. He says, well, what if a person is an athlete? Whose opinion should they listen to? Spectators on the sideline or the trainer or the doctor? Now, the spectators, there's all a sort of ghoulishness about spectators. They wouldn't mind seeing a great sports disaster. So you go to the horse racing event or the jumping event and the spectators are egging somebody on. If the person falls and breaks their neck, well, they would get their money's worth. They would be shocked by it, but there's a certain voyeurism that people have about disasters.
Hockey game?
Yeah, hockey, exactly. Kill, you know. I love hockey. It's the only spectator sport that's fast enough for me. But people like that. They go to boxing matches. If one of the guys gets killed, well, that's even more memorable. So this is true. If you listen to the opinion of many, you might be ruined. So you listen to the opinion of your trainer, the person who knows the limits. So that's the wise person in the case of anything athletic. Now let's go to the center of 105, or just below the center. At the center, Socrates says, well, what does the athlete destroy when he listens to the cheers of the many rather than to the expert opinion of the one? Well, he destroys his body, of course. And isn't life not worth living with a corrupted body? Well, of course. And so if you listen to the many rather than the one, you're going to lead a life that's not worth living because your body will be corrupted. It'll be ruined. And then at the center of that page, 105, Socrates says, nobly spoken. Aren't the other things also like this? And he's moving now from talking about the body to talking about other things, so that we don't have to go through all of them. And in particular, concerning the just and the unjust, and shameful and noble, and good and bad things, about which we are now taking counsel, must we follow the opinion of the many and fear it, rather than that of the one, if there is such an expert, whom we must be ashamed before and fear more than all the others? And if we don't follow him, we will corrupt and maim that thing which, as we used to say, becomes better by the just and is destroyed by the unjust. Or isn't there anything to this? Now, the question is, what is that thing which we used to say it becomes better by the just and is destroyed by the unjust? It's the soul. It's very interesting, though, that Socrates circumlocutes around using the word the soul. And if you turn to the top of the next page, 106, Socrates says, but is life worth living for us with that thing corrupted which the unjust maims and the just profits? You know, it's a very obvious way and wordy way of not saying the soul. Again, from the point of view of Crito, the soul isn't on the map, okay? The soul is something that philosophy knows. And Crito really isn't a philosopher.
You just can't say that.
You know, Socrates' knowledge is of the soul, and Crito isn't. And so there's a kind of indication, a kind of talking around the soul here, indicating the kind of audience maybe that Crito represents.
Down to him?
But is life worth living for us with that thing corrupted which the unjust maims and the just profits? And that thing is the soul. So is life worth living for us without the soul, or with the corruption of the soul? And the answer would be clearly no. He's studiously avoiding his term of technical trade. The thing that he claims to know the most about, the soul, he's not speaking of. And it's interesting, too. He says, on 105 again, and in particular concerning the just and unjust, and shameful and noble, and good and bad things, about which we are now taking counsel, must we follow the opinion of the many, and fear it, rather than that of the one, if there is such an expert, whom we must be ashamed before and fear more than all the others. He's saying if there is an expert on what's shameful and not, what's good and bad, the expert is occluded there too in an odd way. He's put into question. It's under a shadow, in the same way that the soul is sort of hidden in the shadows. And of course everything in this dialogue is in the shadows because it's before dawn. But the thing is that the soul doesn't appear in the darkness of political or pre-political life. It only appears once you move to this trans-political level, because the key to natural law is the soul. We understand the whole of the cosmos, really. We understand nature through understanding the soul. This is the position of the mature Socrates. And this is entirely different from the Socrates of the clown. And when we read the excerpts from the Phaedo for next week, we're going to see Socrates talking about how, at first, he was fascinated by nature, but that made him blind to certain things, including how men grow, which refers again to education and what's educated and cultivated, well, the soul. The soul, he was blinded to by his concern with nature. But now he's undergone has a different way of looking at things, and he begins with knowledge of the soul, because that's closest to us. And he's only willing to venture out into the cosmos at large and make claims about the nature of the whole now through the lens of the human soul, if you will. So he's making sure that he never forgets about the human things by searching for what's natural, because he's only going to approach nature as a whole, or the cosmos as a whole, through the human realm, through the soul. And another way of putting it is that he's only concerned with nature insofar as it can show up to the human being. Okay? And this is the meaning of this humanistic dimension of Socrates and Plato. That what's central to them and what the kind of knowledge that they believe that we can have the greatest certainty about is knowledge of the human soul and of human things. And insofar as the larger cosmos can show up to a human knower, then they'll speak about that too. And they'll even use the moral and practical needs of the human soul as a basis for making speculations about the whole cosmos. But what's very clear is that knowledge of the cosmos and knowledge of the soul have different statuses. That we know the soul with greater certitude than we know anything else. We know the cosmos only insofar as it shows itself to human knowers. And only by knowing human beings in the limits of our knowledge first can we then venture out into the larger world and try and make claims about how it all fits together, which is designed to avoid the problem of the Socrates of the clouds, who thinks that he has expert knowledge. He says, do you want to know divine things exactly in the clouds? You know, he claims to have an exactitude and rigor in his knowledge about the cosmos in the clouds, whereas in the Phaedo, he doesn't claim that anymore. But he does claim to know spectacularly well the nature of human things. And the primary thing that he knows is the human soul. But that only becomes apparent once you move above the realm of pre-political life and political life, which are ruled entirely by convention, to this trans-political realm where the life of the mind is carried on. However, it's also going to become clear to us that when you move up to this level, and you talk about the soul and you talk about nature, it's occasionally useful to dip down into the world of convention and bring back certain stories, likely stories, or myths, that can help us make speeches about things that the limits of reason do not allow us to have any proper or exact knowledge. Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, based on certain paleontological discoveries, that actually myths are older than the human race itself. Because if you look at our nearest ancestor, the Neanderthal, you find that they buried their dead along with their possessions. Whereas if you look at previous hominid types, they would just discard the bodies of their own dead in the same way as they discard the bodies of animals that they ate. Some people take that fact as an indication that the Neanderthal believed in an afterlife, in some sense. And they had a certain respect for the dead. And so these primal and human institutions that Vico talks about, burial and religion, and perhaps family life too, seem to be pre-human. The point is that myth is maybe older than humanity, that the human race itself, and that maybe the myths that are at the core of mythical traditions, the actual stories, are older than the human race itself.